The year is 520 CE. A merchant vessel from distant Constantinople glides through the Red Sea, its hull heavy with silk and spices, its crew weary from months at sea. As the ship approaches the eastern African coast, the sailors glimpse something that steals their breath, a towering obelisk piercing the sky, its granite surface catching the sun like a blade of light. Around it, a city sprawls across the highlands, its stone palaces and temples rivaling anything in Rome or Persia. This is Aksum, and for centuries it has been one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. Yet today, most of the world has forgotten it ever existed. How does a kingdom that once stood shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Persia, and China vanish so completely from our collective memory? How does an empire that minted its own gold coins, erected monuments taller than any in Europe, and controlled trade routes spanning 3 continents become a footnote in history books if it appears at all? The story of Aksum is not just the tale of a forgotten superpower. It is a reminder that history is written by those who survive to tell it, and that the greatest civilizations can be erased not by conquest, but by silence. If you're tired of the same old narratives that ignore Africa's true power and glory, then you need to subscribe right now. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the real history, the stories they didn't teach you in school, the empires they erased from the textbooks, the truth about Africa's place at the center of the ancient world. Hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning. The highlands of northern Ethiopia rise like a fortress from the East African landscape, their peaks crowned with clouds, their valleys thick with juniper forests and wild olive groves. This is the roof of Africa, a realm of cool air and fertile soil, where rainfall is plentiful and the land yields crops in abundance. It is here, in these rugged mountains, that the seeds of Aksum were planted more than 2,000 years ago. But to understand how this kingdom rose to become one of the ancient world's great powers, we must first look beyond Africa itself to the southern Arabian Peninsula, where the story truly begins. Across the narrow strait of the Red Sea, in what is now Yemen, a sophisticated culture had flourished for centuries. The Sabaeans, masters of irrigation and architecture, had built a civilization around the frankincense trade, their caravans carrying precious resins to Egypt, Rome, and beyond. But by the first millennium BCE, some of these Arabian peoples began to cross the Red Sea, drawn by the promise of new lands and opportunities. They brought with them their language, a Semitic tongue that would evolve into Ge'ez, their gods, and their knowledge of writing, agriculture, and statecraft. When these migrants encountered the indigenous Cushitic peoples of the Ethiopian highlands, something remarkable occurred. Instead of conquest or displacement, there was fusion, a blending of cultures that would create something entirely new. The early settlements were modest. Clusters of stone houses perched on hilltops, their inhabitants farming the fertile valleys and herding livestock across the plateaus. But these communities possessed something that would prove invaluable: position. The highlands overlooked the Red Sea, one of the ancient world's most important trade routes. Ships sailing between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean had to pass through these waters, and the ports along the African coast became essential stopping points for merchants seeking fresh water, provisions, and trade goods. The people of the highlands quickly recognized the opportunity. They began to cultivate relationships with foreign traders, offering ivory, gold, and exotic animal hides in exchange for textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods from distant lands. By the 1st century CE, one settlement had begun to eclipse all others: Aksum, situated in a fertile valley with access to both the highlands and the coast, emerged as the region's political and economic center. The town's position was strategic genius, close enough to the Red Sea port of Adulis to control maritime trade, yet far enough inland to be protected from naval raids. Around Aksum, the land was rich and well-watered, capable of supporting a growing population. The surrounding mountains held deposits of gold and iron, resources that would fuel the kingdom's expansion. And the people of Aksum possessed something perhaps even more valuable than natural resources: ambition. The early kings of Aksum were not content to remain local chieftains. They understood that true power in the ancient world came from controlling trade, and they set about systematically expanding their influence. To the north, they pushed into the rugged borderlands of what is now Eritrea, securing control of the trade routes that connected the interior with the coast. To the south and west, they extended their authority over the fertile agricultural regions, ensuring a steady food supply for their growing capital. And across the Red Sea, they began to intervene in the affairs of southern Arabia, protecting their commercial interests and projecting power far beyond the African continent. By the 3rd century CE, Aksum had transformed from a regional power into an international force. The kingdom's merchants dominated the Red Sea trade, their ships carrying African goods to Arabia, India, and beyond, returning with spices, silk, and precious stones. Aksumite caravans traveled inland, bringing Mediterranean and Asian luxuries to the kingdoms of the African interior, returning with gold, ivory, and slaves. The wealth that flowed through Aksum was staggering, and it manifested in ways that announced the kingdom's arrival on the world stage. The most visible symbol of Aksumite power was its coinage. In the mid-3rd century, King Endubis became the first sub-Saharan African ruler to mint his own coins, a move that placed Aksum in the exclusive club of civilizations considered sophisticated enough to produce standardized currency. These were not crude tokens, but finely crafted pieces of gold, silver, and bronze, bearing the king's image and inscriptions in Ge'ez. The minting of coins was more than an economic innovation, it was a declaration of sovereignty, a statement that Aksum stood as an equal to Rome, Persia, and the other great powers of the age. The coins themselves tell a story of Aksum's confidence and ambition. On their faces, Aksumite kings appear in profile, wearing elaborate crowns and holding symbols of authority. The inscriptions invoke divine favor, proclaiming the king as the chosen representative of the gods. But these coins were not merely for domestic use. They circulated throughout the Red Sea region and beyond, accepted as payment in distant markets, their gold content trusted by merchants from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Every transaction conducted with an Aksumite coin was an advertisement for the kingdom's wealth and stability, a reminder that in this corner of Africa, a civilization had arisen that could not be ignored. The capital itself reflected this newfound grandeur. Aksum grew from a collection of stone houses into a true city, its streets lined with multi-story buildings, its center dominated by royal palaces and temples. The architecture was distinctive. Stone walls constructed without mortar, their blocks so precisely cut that they fit together seamlessly, their corners adorned with decorative insets of wood that created striking geometric patterns. These were not the mud brick structures common in much of ancient Africa, but permanent monuments built to last for centuries, physical manifestations of Aksumite power and sophistication. But it was the stele that truly set Aksum apart, that announced to the world that something extraordinary was happening in these highlands. These massive obelisks, carved from single blocks of granite, rose above the city like fingers pointing toward heaven. The largest, standing over 30 meters tall and weighing hundreds of tons, was the tallest single stone monument ever erected in the ancient world, taller than the Egyptian obelisks, more massive than anything built in Rome or Greece. How the Aksumites quarried these enormous stones, transported them from the mountains to the capital, and raised them to stand upright remains a testament to their engineering prowess and organizational capacity. The stelae were not merely displays of power, though they certainly served that purpose. They were funerary monuments, marking the underground tombs of Aksumite kings and nobles. Carved into their surfaces were representations of multi-story buildings, complete with windows, doors, and decorative elements, as if the monuments themselves were palaces frozen in stone. At their tops, many bore the crescent and disc symbol, an emblem associated with the Aksumite royal house. To stand in the shadow of these monuments was to feel the weight of history, to understand viscerally that this was a civilization that was built not for a season or a lifetime, but for eternity. The kingdom's expansion continued through the 4th century, its influence spreading across a vast territory. To the west, Aksumite authority extended deep into the interior of the African continent, reaching the kingdoms of the Nile Valley. To the east, across the Red Sea, Aksumite forces repeatedly intervened in southern Arabia, sometimes as allies of local rulers, sometimes as conquerors in their own right. The kingdom controlled both sides of one of the world's most important waterways, an achievement that placed it at the center of global commerce and politics. It was during this period of expansion and prosperity that Aksum underwent a transformation that would define its character for centuries to come. In the year 333 CE, a remarkable event occurred. King Ezana, one of Aksum's most powerful monarchs, converted to Christianity. The story of this conversion, preserved in both Aksumite inscriptions and foreign chronicles, reveals much about the kingdom's character and its connections to the wider world. According to tradition, two young Christians from the Roman Empire, Frumentius and Aedesius, were shipwrecked on the African coast while returning from a voyage to India. Captured and brought to the Aksumite court, they eventually gained the trust of the royal family, with Frumentius becoming a tutor to the young prince who would become King Ezana. As Ezana grew to adulthood and assumed the throne, Frumentius shared with him the teachings of Christianity, a faith that was rapidly spreading through the Roman Empire but had barely touched Africa beyond Egypt. Impressed by the religion's message and perhaps seeing political advantages in aligning with the faith of Rome, Ezana embraced Christianity and declared it the official religion of his kingdom. This conversion was revolutionary. Aksum became only the second kingdom in the world, after Armenia, to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion, doing so before even Rome itself made Christianity its official faith. The decision connected Aksum to the broader Christian world, forging religious and cultural ties with Byzantium, Egypt, and the emerging Christian kingdoms of the Mediterranean. It also distinguished Aksum from its neighbors and rivals, giving the kingdom a unique identity that set it apart in a region dominated by traditional African religions and, increasingly, by the expansion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula. The impact of Christianity on Aksumite culture was profound and immediate. The old gods, the deities inherited from the kingdom's Arabian ancestors, and the spirits of the African highlands were officially abandoned. Temples were converted into churches, and new religious structures were built, following Christian architectural principles. The most significant of these was the Church of Mary of Zion, constructed in Aksum itself, which would become one of the most sacred sites in Ethiopian Christianity. The kingdom's coinage changed as well, with pagan symbols replaced by the Christian cross, a bold declaration of faith that appeared on every coin minted in the realm. But Ezana's Christianity did not make Aksum a passive or peaceful kingdom. If anything, the adoption of the new faith seemed to intensify the kingdom's military ambitions, providing divine justification for campaigns of conquest and expansion. Ezana's inscriptions, carved in stone and preserved for posterity, reveal a ruler who saw himself as God's chosen instrument, a Christian king with a mandate to spread his faith and extend his authority. In multiple military campaigns, he led Aksumite forces against neighboring peoples, defeating armies, subduing rebellious provinces, and expanding the kingdom's borders to their greatest extent. One of Ezana's inscriptions, discovered in the 20th century, provides a vivid account of a campaign against the Noba people to the west. The text is remarkable for its detail and its tone, revealing not just a military victory, but a complete subjugation. Ezana describes how his forces pursued the enemy, capturing their leaders, seizing their cattle, and forcing entire populations into submission. The inscription concludes with a statement of divine favor, attributing the victory to God's will and Ezana's righteousness. This was not merely a battle report, it was a theological statement, a declaration that Aksumite power was backed by the Christian God himself. The Christianization of Aksum also transformed the kingdom's relationship with its neighbors and with the wider world. The Red Sea, already dominated by Aksumite naval and commercial power, became a Christian lake of sorts, with Aksum controlling the African side and maintaining strong ties with Christian communities in Egypt and the Byzantine Empire. This religious connection proved valuable in both trade and diplomacy, as Aksumite merchants found ready partners among Christian traders throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East. The kingdom's position as a Christian power in a region increasingly divided between Christianity and other faiths gave it a unique role as a bridge between civilizations. Yet Aksum's Christianity was distinctively African from the beginning. The faith that took root in the highlands was not a mere copy of Roman or Byzantine Christianity, but something adapted to the Ethiopian context. The Aksumites developed their own Christian traditions, their own liturgical practices, and their own theological interpretations. The Bible was translated into Ge'ez, the kingdom's language, making Aksum one of the few places in the ancient world where Christianity was practiced in a native African tongue rather than in Greek or Latin. This linguistic and cultural independence would prove crucial to the survival of Ethiopian Christianity in the centuries to come. By the mid-4th century, Aksum stood at the height of its power. The kingdom controlled territory stretching from the Nile Valley to the Arabian Peninsula, from the Red Sea coast deep into the African interior. Its capital was a cosmopolitan center where merchants from Rome, Persia, India, and China mingled with local traders and royal officials. The port of Adulis bustled with ships from every corner of the known world, their holds filled with goods destined for distant markets. Gold, frankincense, myrrh, ivory, and exotic animals flowed through Aksumite hands, generating wealth that funded the kingdom's monuments, armies, and luxuries. The kingdom's military strength was formidable and diverse. Aksumite armies combined highland warriors, skilled with spears and swords, with cavalry units and even war elephants captured from the African interior. These forces were well organized and professionally led, capable of sustained campaigns far from home. Aksumite naval power controlled the Red Sea, protecting the kingdom's trade routes and projecting force across the water to Arabia when necessary. This military capability, combined with economic dominance and the prestige of the Christian faith, made Aksum one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, acknowledged as such by contemporary observers. A Persian philosopher of the 3rd century, Mani, listed the 4 great kingdoms of his age: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. This recognition was not courtesy or exaggeration, it was a realistic assessment of global power. Aksum controlled resources and trade routes that the other empires needed. Its diplomatic reach extended to Constantinople, where Aksumite ambassadors were received with honor. Its coins circulated as far as India, where they were accepted as reliable currency. Its military interventions in Arabia affected the balance of power between Rome and Persia. This was not a regional African kingdom, this was a superpower, a civilization that shaped the ancient world's politics and economy. The reign of King Caleb in the early 6th century marked both the zenith of Aksumite power and the beginning of the forces that would eventually undermine the kingdom. Caleb, also known as Ella Asbihay, was perhaps Aksum's greatest warrior king, a ruler whose military achievements would echo through history, but whose campaigns would also stretch the kingdom's resources to their limits. His story is one of religious fervor, military brilliance, and the dangerous temptations of imperial overreach. In the year 520 CE, news reached Aksum that sent shockwaves through the Christian world. In Himyar, a kingdom in southern Arabia that had long been within Aksum's sphere of influence, a Jewish king named Du-Nuwas had seized power and launched a violent persecution of the region's Christian population. The most infamous incident occurred in the city of Najran, where Du-Nuwas ordered Christians to renounce their faith or face death. When they refused, hundreds were burned alive in trenches, an atrocity that horrified Christians throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean. For King Caleb, the massacre at Najran was both a religious outrage and a political challenge. As a Christian monarch, he could not ignore the persecution of fellow believers. As an Aksumite king, he could not allow a hostile power to control southern Arabia, threatening the trade routes that were the lifeblood of his kingdom. The response was decisive and overwhelming. Caleb assembled a massive army and a fleet of ships, then launched an invasion across the Red Sea that would become one of the most ambitious military operations of the 6th century. The Aksumite invasion of Himyar was a triumph of logistics and military skill. Transporting an army across open water, landing on hostile shores, and conducting a sustained campaign in difficult terrain required organizational capacity that few ancient kingdoms possessed. But Caleb's forces accomplished all of this and more. They landed on the Arabian coast, defeated Du Nuwaz's army in a series of battles, and hunted down the Jewish king himself, who died trying to escape. Aksumite forces then occupied the kingdom, installing a Christian ruler loyal to Aksum and establishing a military presence that would last for decades. The victory seemed complete, a demonstration of Aksumite power that reverberated across the ancient world. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Justin I celebrated the triumph of a fellow Christian monarch over the persecutors of the faith. Throughout the Christian East, Caleb was hailed as a hero and defender of Christianity. For Aksum, the conquest of Himyar represented the greatest extent of the kingdom's territorial reach, control of both sides of the Red Sea, from the highlands of Ethiopia to the mountains of Yemen. Yet, this moment of supreme triumph contained the seeds of future decline. Maintaining control over southern Arabia proved far more difficult than conquering it. The region was fractious, divided between rival tribes and religious factions. The Aksumite occupation required a permanent military presence, draining resources and manpower from the homeland. The Himyarite Arabs, proud and independent, chafed under foreign rule, regardless of the occupier's religious identity. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, forcing Aksum to send fresh troops and resources across the Red Sea to maintain order. What had begun as a glorious conquest became a quagmire, a distant commitment that weakened the kingdom without providing commensurate benefits. Meanwhile, forces far beyond Aksumite control were reshaping the geopolitical landscape. To the north, the Byzantine Empire and Sassanid Persia were locked in a series of devastating wars that disrupted trade routes and destabilized the entire Middle East. To the east, new powers were rising in Arabia, including a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad, who would soon found a religion that would transform the world. The ancient order that had allowed Aksum to flourish was beginning to crack, and the kingdom found itself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The rise of Islam in the early 7th century fundamentally altered the strategic environment in which Aksum operated. Muhammad's followers, driven by religious fervor and political ambition, burst out of the Arabian Peninsula, conquering vast territories with stunning speed. Within decades of the Prophet's death, Islamic armies had defeated both the Byzantine and Persian empires, seized control of Egypt and the Levant, and established a caliphate that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. The Red Sea, once dominated by Christian Aksum, became an Islamic waterway, controlled by Muslim rulers who viewed the African kingdom with suspicion and hostility. Yet in these early years, the relationship between Aksum and the emerging Islamic world was complex and not entirely hostile. According to Islamic tradition, when Muhammad's followers faced persecution in Mecca, the Prophet advised them to seek refuge in the land of the Abyssinians, where a king rules who does not tolerate injustice. A group of Muslim refugees, including Muhammad's daughter Ruqayya, crossed the Red Sea and found sanctuary in the Aksumite kingdom. The Aksumite Negus, the title for the king, granted them protection, refusing demands from Meccan leaders to hand over the refugees. This act of hospitality would be remembered in Islamic tradition, and later Muslim conquerors would cite it as a reason to spare Ethiopia from the jihad that swept across the Middle East and North Africa. But protection from conquest did not mean preservation of power. As Islam spread, Aksumite influence shrank dramatically. The kingdom's Arabian territories were lost, conquered by Muslim forces that faced little effective resistance. The port of Adulis, once the gateway to global trade, found itself cut off from the wider Islamic world, its commerce reduced to a trickle. The trade routes that had made Aksum wealthy and powerful shifted, bypassing the Red Sea ports under Aksumite control and flowing instead through territories controlled by the new Islamic caliphates. The gold that had funded Aksumite grandeur dried up, as the kingdom lost access to the international markets that had sustained it. The decline was gradual but inexorable. By the late 7th century, Aksum had ceased to be a major player in regional politics, its influence confined to the Ethiopian highlands and the immediately surrounding territories. The kingdom's coinage, once accepted from India to Rome, stopped being minted altogether, a clear sign of economic collapse and loss of international prestige. The great monuments of the capital, the stelae and palaces that had announced Aksumite power to the world, fell into disrepair, their stones plundered for other buildings or simply left to weather and decay. The cosmopolitan city that had hosted merchants from 3 continents became a provincial town, isolated from the currents of global trade and culture. Environmental factors compounded these political and economic challenges. Climate change, a prolonged drought that affected much of the Horn of Africa in the late first millennium, reduced agricultural productivity and undermined the kingdom's food security. The fertile highlands that had sustained a large population could no longer support the density of settlement that had characterized Aksum at its height. Communities dispersed, moving to more productive areas or reverting to pastoralism as farming became less viable. The population of the capital shrank, and eventually the center of Ethiopian power itself shifted southward, away from Aksum to new capitals in more favorable locations. By the 10th century, the kingdom of Aksum had effectively ceased to exist as a major political entity. The continuous state that emerged in the Ethiopian highlands, what would eventually become the Ethiopian Empire, maintained cultural and religious continuity with Aksum, but the political organization, economic base, and international connections that had made Aksum a superpower were gone. The kingdom's collapse was so complete that later generations of Ethiopians, while preserving legends and religious traditions connected to Aksum, often had only confused memories of the kingdom's actual history and achievements. The physical evidence of Aksumite glory remained, but even this was vulnerable to the passage of time and human neglect. The great stelae stood like silent sentinels over a dying city, but one by one they fell. The largest, the monument that had been taller than any obelisk in Egypt or Rome, collapsed at some point in the medieval period, broken into massive segments that lay scattered across the ground. Whether it fell due to an earthquake, structural failure, or deliberate destruction is unknown. The event was not recorded, or if it was, the records have not survived. The underground tombs that the stelae marked were looted, their treasures scattered or melted down, their royal occupants disturbed and forgotten. The Church of Mary of Zion, rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, remained a center of Ethiopian Christianity, but the city around it shrank to a shadow of its former self. For centuries, Aksum existed in a strange twilight, remembered in religious tradition and legend, but forgotten as a historical reality. Ethiopian Christians knew that their faith had ancient roots, that their church had been founded in the time of the apostles, that their kings claimed descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But the concrete details of Aksumite civilization, its trade networks, its military campaigns, its role in shaping the ancient world, were lost to memory, preserved only in scattered inscriptions and the mute testimony of ruins that few outsiders visited or understood. The larger world forgot Aksum entirely. European scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries, reconstructing the history of the ancient world, knew of Rome and Greece, of Egypt and Persia, of China and India. But of Aksum, they knew nothing, or next to nothing. The kingdom did not appear in classical Western histories because those histories had been written by Greeks and Romans, whose contacts with Aksum were limited and whose accounts had largely been lost. When European explorers and colonizers arrived in Africa in the modern era, they brought with them assumptions about African primitiveness and lack of civilization that made it difficult for them to recognize or acknowledge evidence of sophisticated African kingdoms. The idea that black Africans had built a civilization to rival Rome was simply not compatible with the racial hierarchies that justified European colonialism. Even when European travelers did encounter Aksumite ruins, they often attributed them to anyone but the Africans themselves. The massive stone monuments must have been built by Arabs or Jews or ancient colonizers from the Mediterranean, anyone but the indigenous people of the highlands who could not possibly have possessed the knowledge, organization, and resources to create such wonders. This intellectual colonialism, the refusal to credit Africans with their own achievements, contributed to Aksum's erasure from global historical consciousness as effectively as any military defeat or economic collapse. It was not until the 20th century that serious archaeological and historical research began to uncover the true scope and significance of Aksumite civilization. Excavations revealed the foundations of palaces and churches, underground tombs containing grave goods that testified to the kingdom's wealth, and inscriptions that recorded the deeds of Aksumite kings in their own words. The study of coinage, scattered across museum collections from Europe to India, revealed the extent of Aksumite trade networks and the kingdom's economic sophistication. Slowly, painstakingly, scholars pieced together the story of this forgotten superpower, resurrecting from obscurity a civilization that had once been counted among the world's greatest. The archaeological evidence is stunning in its richness and its implications. The royal tombs beneath Aksum contain artifacts from across the ancient world: Roman glassware, Indian textiles, Persian metalwork, physical proof of the kingdom's participation in global trade networks. The inscriptions, written in Ge'ez, Sabaean, and Greek, demonstrate that Aksumite rulers were multilingual and cosmopolitan, comfortable operating in the cultural contexts of different civilizations. The monumental architecture, from the stelae to the palace complexes, shows engineering capabilities and organizational capacity that rival any ancient civilization. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Aksum was not a marginal African kingdom, but a major player in the ancient world, a superpower in every meaningful sense of the term. Yet despite this archaeological resurrection, Aksum remains largely unknown outside academic circles, and the communities descended from its people. History textbooks, when they mention sub-Saharan Africa at all before the modern era, rarely give Aksum more than a paragraph, if that. Popular understanding of ancient civilizations focuses on the familiar names Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, while Aksum and other African kingdoms are relegated to the margins or ignored entirely. This continued obscurity is not accidental or innocent. It reflects deep-seated biases about Africa and African history, assumptions that African civilizations were primitive or derivative, that African achievements were somehow less significant than those of European or Asian societies. The forgetting of Aksum is thus more than a historical curiosity. It is a case study in how history is constructed and who gets to tell it. The kingdom's erasure from popular consciousness demonstrates how civilizations can be written out of history, not because they were insignificant, but because their existence challenges narratives about racial hierarchies and civilizational superiority. The fact that a black African kingdom once stood as an equal to Rome and Persia, that it minted coins accepted across 3 continents, that it built monuments taller than anything in the ancient Mediterranean. These facts are uncomfortable for histories that portray Africa as a dark continent, lacking civilization until Europeans arrived to bring it. But the story of Aksum is also a testament to resilience and continuity. Though the kingdom itself collapsed, its legacy survived. Ethiopian Christianity, born in the Aksumite era, remains one of the world's oldest continuous Christian traditions, with liturgical practices and sacred texts that date back to the 4th century. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves memories and traditions of Aksum, maintaining that the Ark of the Covenant itself rests in the Church of Mary of Zion in Aksum, a claim that, whether factual or legendary, speaks to the kingdom's enduring place in Ethiopian identity. The Ge'ez language, though no longer spoken in daily life, survives as a liturgical language, connecting modern Ethiopians to their ancient past, and the physical monuments, though weathered and broken, still stand, tangible evidence of a civilization's grandeur. In recent decades, there has been growing recognition of Aksum's historical significance and growing efforts to reclaim and celebrate this heritage. The Ethiopian government has invested in preserving Aksumite sites and promoting them as tourist destinations, seeking to educate both Ethiopians and the world about this forgotten chapter of history. Scholars from Africa and the diaspora have taken leading roles in researching and interpreting Aksumite civilization, challenging Eurocentric narratives and insisting on Africa's place at the center of human history. Popular media, from documentaries to books to online content, has begun to tell the story of Aksum to wider audiences, slowly chipping away at the obscurity that has surrounded the kingdom for centuries. The rediscovery of Aksum has profound implications for how we understand ancient history and Africa's place within it. It challenges the notion that civilization was something that spread from Europe and the Middle East to a passive Africa, revealing instead a continent that was home to sophisticated states and cultures that interacted with the wider world as equals. It demonstrates that African societies were capable of monumental architecture, long-distance trade, literary culture, and political organization, all the markers of advanced civilization that European scholars once claimed were absent from sub-Saharan Africa. And it provides concrete evidence against racist narratives that portrayed black Africans as historically incapable of building great civilizations, narratives that were used to justify slavery, colonialism, and ongoing marginalization. For people of African descent, particularly those in the diaspora, the story of Aksum is empowering and affirming. It provides historical proof of African achievement and sophistication, a counter-narrative to the degrading stereotypes that have been used to dehumanize black people. To know that your ancestors built monuments taller than Roman obelisks, that they minted gold coins accepted across the ancient world, that they were counted among the great powers of their age, this knowledge is powerful. It refutes centuries of propaganda that portrayed Africa as a land without history, a continent that existed in primitive stasis until Europeans arrived to bring civilization. It restores dignity and pride by revealing a past that was deliberately hidden. The story of Aksum also raises important questions about historical memory and the construction of narratives. Why do some civilizations remain famous while others are forgotten? Why does everyone know about ancient Rome but not ancient Aksum, when both were superpowers of their era? The answer is not about the relative achievements or importance of these civilizations, but about power and perspective. History has traditionally been written by the victors, by those with the resources and platforms to tell their stories and preserve their memories. The civilizations that conquered or colonized others got to write the textbooks, to decide what was important and what could be ignored. In this process, African civilizations were systematically erased or minimized, their achievements attributed to outside influences, their significance denied. Reclaiming the story of Aksum is thus an act of historical justice, a correction of deliberate distortions and omissions. It is part of a larger project of decolonizing history, of centering African perspectives and African achievements in narratives that have too often marginalized or excluded them. This work is not about replacing one biased narrative with another, but about achieving a more complete and accurate understanding of human history, one that recognizes the contributions of all peoples and regions, that acknowledges Africa's role in shaping the ancient world, that gives credit where credit is due. The legacy of Aksum extends beyond historical knowledge to questions of identity and cultural continuity. Modern Ethiopia, despite its many transformations over the centuries, maintains a direct connection to its Aksumite past through language, religion, and cultural practices. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its founding to the conversion of King Ezana, and its liturgy and sacred texts preserve elements of Aksumite Christianity. The Ethiopian script, derived from Ge'ez, maintains continuity with the written language of the ancient kingdom. Ethiopian royal ideology, until the fall of the monarchy in 1974, claimed descent from the Aksumite dynasty, and through them from the biblical King Solomon. This continuity, rare in Africa where colonialism and other disruptions often severed connections to pre-colonial pasts, makes Ethiopia unique. A modern nation that can point to an ancient civilization as its direct ancestor. For the Ethiopian people, Aksum is not just ancient history, but a living heritage, a source of national pride and cultural identity. The ancient monuments are national symbols, appearing on currency and government seals. The story of Aksum's glory and eventual decline is taught in schools, used to inspire national unity and resilience in the face of challenges. The kingdom's Christian heritage is central to Ethiopian Orthodox identity, distinguishing Ethiopia from its predominantly Muslim neighbors and connecting the nation to a broader Christian world. And the fact that Ethiopia was never successfully colonized, remaining independent except for the brief Italian occupation from 1936 to 1941, is often linked to this ancient heritage, to a tradition of sovereignty and resistance that stretches back to Aksumite times. But the story of Aksum also offers lessons and warnings that transcend Ethiopian national identity. The kingdom's rise demonstrates the importance of strategic position, control of trade routes, and cultural adaptation. The Aksumites' success came from their ability to position themselves at the crossroads of civilizations and to synthesize influences from Africa and Arabia into something new. Their conversion to Christianity, a bold move that connected them to the wider Christian world while distinguishing them from their neighbors, shows the power of cultural and religious identity in building alliances and legitimizing authority. The grandeur of their monuments and the sophistication of their coinage reveal the importance of symbolic power, of tangible demonstrations of wealth and capability that announce a civilization's arrival on the world stage. But Aksum's decline offers equally important lessons. The kingdom's overextension in Arabia, the costly military campaigns that drained resources without providing lasting benefits, demonstrates the dangers of imperial overreach. The vulnerability of a trade-based economy to geopolitical shifts beyond one's control, as demonstrated by the rise of Islam and the redirection of trade routes, shows the fragility of power based on middleman status rather than productive capacity. The environmental challenges that undermined agricultural productivity remind us that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable to forces of nature. And the completeness of Aksum's collapse, the way a superpower could simply fade away, leaving barely a trace in global memory, serves as a humbling reminder of the impermanence of all human achievements. Perhaps most significantly, the forgetting of Aksum illustrates the power of narrative and the politics of historical memory. A civilization that once stood among the world's greatest powers, that was acknowledged as such by its contemporaries, could be almost entirely erased from popular historical consciousness, not because it was unimportant, but because later generations chose not to remember it, or because those who controlled the telling of history found its existence inconvenient or incomprehensible. This erasure was not an accident or a natural process of forgetting, but a deliberate exclusion rooted in racial prejudice and colonial ideology that could not accommodate evidence of African achievement and sophistication. The rediscovery and reclamation of Aksumite history in recent decades represents a challenge to this erasure and to the narratives that justified it. Every archaeological excavation that reveals the sophistication of Aksumite culture, every scholarly article that places Aksum in its proper context as a major ancient power, every documentary or book or social media post that tells the kingdom's story to a wider audience, these are all acts of resistance against historical marginalization. They are assertions that African history matters, that African civilizations were as complex and capable as any others, that the story of humanity cannot be told honestly without including the story of Aksum and kingdoms like it. For contemporary Africa, the legacy of Aksum offers both inspiration and challenge. The inspiration comes from the concrete proof of African achievement, the undeniable evidence that Africans built great civilizations, engaged in long-distance trade, created monumental architecture, and participated as equals in the ancient world's political and economic systems. This history refutes the degrading narratives that have been used to justify Africa's exploitation and marginalization, providing instead a foundation for pride and self-confidence. If Africans built Aksum, if they were counted among the world's great powers, then there is no reason why modern African nations cannot achieve similar prominence and respect. The challenge comes from asking why these achievements did not lead to continuous development, why Africa fell behind other regions in subsequent centuries, and what lessons can be learned from civilizations like Aksum that flourished but ultimately declined. These are complex questions without simple answers, involving factors from geography and disease to colonialism and the slave trade. But engaging seriously with African history, including the history of kingdoms like Aksum, is essential for understanding Africa's present and imagining its future. The past is not simply a source of pride or lamentation, it is a resource for understanding patterns, learning from successes and failures, and building on foundations that, though ancient, remain relevant. The story of Aksum is ultimately a story about visibility and erasure, about power and memory, about how civilizations rise and fall, and how their stories are told or forgotten. It is a reminder that history is not a neutral record of facts, but a contested terrain where different groups struggle to define the past in ways that serve their present interests. For too long, African history was written by outsiders, by colonizers and their intellectual heirs, who had little interest in acknowledging African achievements and every reason to minimize or deny them. The result was a distorted history that portrayed Africa as a continent without civilization, a dark continent that contributed nothing to human progress until Europeans arrived to enlighten it. But the stones of Aksum, weathered but still standing, tell a different story. The inscriptions of Aksumite kings, proclaiming their victories and their faith, tell a different story. The coins scattered in museum collections from London to New Delhi, bearing the images of African monarchs and accepted as currency across 3 continents, tell a different story. And the archaeological evidence accumulating from decades of research, revealing the sophistication and extent of Aksumite civilization, tells a different story. It is a story of African power and achievement, of a kingdom that stood as an equal to Rome and Persia, of a civilization that shaped the ancient world's economy and politics. It is a story that deserves to be known, to be taught, to be celebrated, not as an exception that proves the rule of African backwardness, but as one example among many of the sophistication and complexity of African civilizations. The monuments of Aksum stand as silent witnesses to this forgotten history, massive stones that have endured while empires have risen and fallen around them. The tallest of the stelae, now collapsed and broken, once stood as the single largest piece of stone ever erected by human hands in the ancient world. A declaration in granite that here, in the highlands of Africa, a people capable of extraordinary achievements had built something meant to last forever. That it did not last, that the kingdom fell and was forgotten, does not diminish the achievement. It simply reminds us that all civilizations are mortal, that power is fleeting, and that the monuments we build to assert our permanence will themselves crumble in time. But there is a difference between natural decay and deliberate erasure, between the gradual forgetting that comes with the passage of centuries and the active suppression of memories that challenge convenient narratives. Aksum was not simply forgotten, it was erased, written out of histories that could not accommodate evidence of African greatness. The kingdom's absence from popular historical consciousness is not an oversight, but a symptom of deeper biases about Africa and Africans, biases that continue to shape how history is taught and understood. Reclaiming the story of Aksum is thus not merely an academic exercise, but a political act, an assertion that African history matters and that the achievements of African peoples deserve recognition and respect. As we stand in the present, looking back across the centuries at the ruins of Aksum, we are confronted with questions that extend far beyond one ancient kingdom. How many other civilizations have been forgotten or erased, their achievements lost to deliberate neglect or hostile narratives? How much of what we think we know about the past is shaped by the biases and agendas of those who controlled the telling of history? What other stories remain to be uncovered? What other achievements remain to be acknowledged? The rediscovery of Aksum suggests that there is much we do not know, much that has been hidden or distorted, much that remains to be brought to light. For the descendants of the Aksumites, the modern Ethiopians and Eritreans who live in the lands where the ancient kingdom once flourished, this history is both a burden and gift. It is a burden because it invites comparison between past glory and present challenges, because it raises questions about how and why a civilization that once stood among the world's greatest powers has struggled in more recent centuries. But it is also a gift, a source of pride and identity, a reminder of what their ancestors achieved and what they themselves are capable of achieving. The continuity between ancient Aksum and modern Ethiopia is unique in Africa, a living connection to a civilization that predates most of Europe's nation-states, that was Christian when most of Europe was still pagan, that built monuments and minted coins when much of northern Europe was still organized in tribes. For the broader African diaspora, the story of Aksum is equally significant. It provides concrete evidence against the narratives of African inferiority that were used to justify slavery and colonialism that continue to shape racist attitudes in the present. To know that black Africans built a civilization counted among the ancient world's great powers, that they were sophisticated traders and diplomats, that they created monumental architecture and literary culture. This knowledge is a weapon against internalized racism and a foundation for cultural pride. The story of Aksum is not unique in this respect. There are many African civilizations that achieved greatness, but it is particularly powerful because of its international reach and recognition, because even contemporary observers from Rome and Persia acknowledged its significance. For anyone interested in understanding human history in its full complexity, the story of Aksum is essential. It challenges Eurocentric narratives that place Europe at the center of historical development, revealing instead a multipolar ancient world where power and achievement were distributed across continents and cultures. It demonstrates that trade and cultural exchange connected Africa, Asia, and Europe in the ancient world, that these continents were not isolated but intimately interconnected. It shows that Christianity spread to Africa not through European colonizers, but in its earliest centuries, that African Christians were among the first to adopt the faith and develop their own traditions. And it provides a case study in how civilizations rise and fall, how strategic position and cultural adaptation can elevate a kingdom to superpower status, and how geopolitical shifts and environmental changes can bring even mighty civilizations to ruin. The physical legacy of Aksum remains visible in the Ethiopian highlands, a tangible connection to this ancient civilization. The great stelae, though some have fallen and others lean precariously, still mark the site of the ancient capital. The largest, broken into massive segments, lies where it fell centuries ago, its carved surface still visible despite weathering and damage. Standing next to these enormous stones, it is impossible not to be impressed by the ambition and capability of the people who created them. These were not simple stone markers, but complex monuments requiring sophisticated quarrying, transportation, and erection techniques. They represented not just engineering prowess, but organizational capacity, the ability to mobilize labor, coordinate complex projects, and execute designs that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible in the ancient world. The underground tombs, though looted long ago, still testify to the wealth and sophistication of Aksumite burial practices. These elaborate structures, carved into the bedrock beneath the stelae, were designed as eternal resting places for kings and nobles, filled with the riches of a lifetime and the treasures of a kingdom. That they were looted, their contents scattered or destroyed, is a tragedy, but even empty. They reveal the architectural skill and cultural sophistication of their builders. The tombs were not simple holes in the ground, but complex structures with multiple chambers, architectural details, and careful construction. They were designed to last forever, to preserve the bodies and possessions of the dead until the resurrection promised by Christianity. The Church of Mary of Zion, rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, remains the most sacred site in Ethiopian Christianity. Pilgrims come from across Ethiopia and the diaspora to pray at this church, which tradition holds contains the Ark of the Covenant brought from Jerusalem by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether this tradition has any historical basis is debatable. Most scholars are skeptical, but the power of the belief is undeniable. For Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, the church at Aksum is not just a historical site, but a living, sacred space, the repository of their most precious relic and the symbol of their ancient faith. The continuity of worship at this site, from Aksumite times to the present, is remarkable, a thread connecting modern believers to their ancient spiritual ancestors. The legacy of Aksum also lives in less tangible forms, in the cultural practices and beliefs of modern Ethiopians, in the liturgy and sacred texts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in the script and language that descend from ancient Ge'ez. These continuities, often invisible to outsiders, are profound for those who live them. They represent an unbroken connection to the past, a sense that the present grows organically from ancient roots, that contemporary Ethiopians are the heirs of a civilization that predates most of the world's modern nations. This continuity was maintained through centuries of isolation and challenge, through the Islamic expansion that cut Ethiopia off from the wider Christian world, through internal conflicts and external threats, through the attempted Italian colonization and the upheavals of modern Ethiopian history. The story of how Ethiopian Christianity survived and preserved its Aksumite roots is itself remarkable. When the Islamic conquests of the 7th century cut off Ethiopia from the Mediterranean Christian world, the Ethiopian Church did not disappear or lose its faith. Instead, it turned inward, developing its own traditions and interpretations, preserving ancient texts and practices that had been lost elsewhere. Ethiopian monks maintained monasteries in remote locations, copying manuscripts by hand, preserving the Ge'ez language and literature, keeping alive the memory of Aksum even as the kingdom itself faded. This cultural resilience, this determination to maintain identity and tradition in the face of isolation and adversity, is one of the most impressive aspects of Ethiopian history. When contact with European Christians was eventually re-established in the medieval and early modern periods, Europeans were astonished to discover this ancient Christian kingdom in the heart of Africa, practicing a faith that seemed simultaneously familiar and alien. Ethiopian Christianity had developed independently for centuries, evolving unique features, the inclusion of elements from the Old Testament, such as dietary laws and circumcision, the veneration of the Ark of the Covenant, the distinctive liturgy and church architecture. Europeans sometimes struggled to recognize Ethiopian Christianity as legitimate, so different was it from Roman Catholic or Orthodox traditions they knew. But for Ethiopians, these practices were not innovations, but preservations, the maintenance of ancient Christian traditions that had been lost or changed elsewhere. This independent development of Ethiopian Christianity, rooted in Aksumite times, is one of the kingdom's most enduring legacies. It demonstrates that African Christianity was not simply an import from Europe, but had indigenous roots as deep as any, that Africans developed their own interpretations and traditions, that African Christianity has its own integrity and authenticity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church stands as proof that Christianity is not inherently European, that the faith took root in Africa in its earliest centuries and developed in distinctly African ways. This is significant not just for Ethiopian Christians, but for Christians throughout Africa and the diaspora, providing a counter-narrative to colonial Christianity that often portrayed African believers as inferior, or their faith as a pale imitation of European models. The modern nation of Ethiopia, despite its many challenges and transformations, maintains this connection to its Aksumite past. The name itself, Ethiopia, is ancient, used by Greek and Roman writers to describe the lands of the black-skinned peoples south of Egypt. The territory of modern Ethiopia does not precisely correspond to ancient Aksum, but there is continuity of culture, religion, and language that makes the connection real and meaningful. Ethiopian national identity is built in part on this ancient heritage, on the pride of being the only African nation to maintain independence through the colonial era, on the claim of continuous statehood stretching back thousands of years, on the possession of one of the world's oldest Christian traditions. This connection to ancient glory can be both inspiring and burdensome for modern Ethiopians. It inspires pride and resilience, a sense that Ethiopians are the heirs of a great civilization and capable of meeting modern challenges. But it can also create pressure and disappointment, an uncomfortable contrast between past achievements and present struggles. Ethiopia today faces many challenges: poverty, political instability, ethnic tensions, environmental degradation. For a nation that once hosted one of the world's great civilizations, these present difficulties can feel like a fall from grace, a decline from past heights. Yet, this perspective may be misleading. The challenges modern Ethiopia faces are not unique to it, but are shared by many developing nations, particularly in Africa. What is unique is the long historical perspective that makes these challenges seem like decline, rather than simply the difficulties of a nation working to develop in a challenging global environment. The archaeological study of Aksum continues to yield new discoveries and insights, deepening our understanding of this ancient civilization. Recent excavations have uncovered new palatial structures, revealed details of daily life in the Aksumite capital, and pushed back the dates for some of the kingdom's developments. The use of new technologies, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, sophisticated dating techniques has allowed researchers to map the extent of Aksumite settlements and understand the kingdom's development in new ways. Each new discovery adds to the picture of Aksumite civilization, filling in details that were lost when the kingdom fell and was forgotten. One of the most significant recent developments has been the return of cultural artifacts to Ethiopia. For decades, many of the most important Aksumite artifacts, including manuscripts, coins, and art objects, were held in museums and collections outside the country, taken by European explorers, colonizers, or archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Italian occupation from 1936 to 1941 was particularly devastating, with Mussolini's forces looting treasures, including an ancient obelisk that was transported to Rome and erected there as a symbol of Italian imperial ambition. The return of this obelisk in 2005, carefully dismantled and transported back to Aksum, where it was re-erected near its ancient companions, was a moment of profound symbolic importance. It represented not just the return of a physical object, but the recognition of Ethiopia's right to its own heritage, the acknowledgement that the cultural treasures of African civilizations belong in Africa. The preservation and study of Aksumite heritage faces ongoing challenges. The site of ancient Aksum is a living town, with modern buildings encroaching on ancient ruins, making systematic archaeology difficult. Political instability in the region, including conflicts between the Ethiopian government and regional forces, has sometimes disrupted research and threatened the preservation of sites. Climate change threatens the physical monuments, with increased rainfall and temperature fluctuations accelerating erosion and decay, and limited resources mean that Ethiopian archaeologists and heritage professionals must make difficult choices about what to preserve and study with inadequate funding and support. Yet despite these challenges, the work continues. Ethiopian scholars and international collaborators are documenting Aksumite sites, preserving artifacts, training new generations of archaeologists and historians, and sharing the story of Aksum with wider audiences. Each year brings new publications, new discoveries, new insights into this ancient civilization. The monuments themselves, weathered but enduring, continue to stand as witnesses to a forgotten past, silent challenges to the narratives that erased Aksum from global historical consciousness. They demand recognition, acknowledgement, respect. They demand that the story of Aksum be told and remembered. And so we return to where we began, standing in imagination before the great stele of Aksum. These monuments, erected by a people who believed they were building for eternity, have outlasted the kingdom that created them. The kings whose tombs they marked are long forgotten, their names known only from fragmentary inscriptions. The merchants who traded beneath their shadow, the priests who prayed in their vicinity, the ordinary people who lived in their presence, all are gone, their individual stories lost to time. The kingdom itself, which once stood as one of the four great powers of the ancient world, has been forgotten by most of humanity, remembered only in the traditions of its descendants and in the growing body of scholarship that seeks to resurrect its history. Yet the stones remain, massive, weathered, broken in places but still standing. They testify to ambitions that transcended their own time. The people who quarried these granite monoliths from distant mountains, who transported them to the capital through terrain that would challenge modern engineers, who raised them to stand higher than any other monuments of their age, these people were not primitive or backward. They were sophisticated, capable, ambitious. They were the equals of the Romans who built aqueducts and amphitheaters, of the Persians who carved palaces from living rock, of the Chinese who constructed the Great Wall. They were Africans, and they built a civilization that shaped the ancient world. The forgetting of Aksum is a tragedy, but not an inevitable one. The kingdom's erasure from popular historical consciousness was the result of specific choices and biases, the product of a worldview that could not accommodate evidence of African greatness. But that erasure can be reversed. The stones still stand, the inscriptions can still be read, the coins still exist in museum collections, the archaeological evidence accumulates. The story can be told, must be told, will be told not as a curiosity or an exception, but as an integral part of human history, a chapter in the story of how civilizations rise and fall, of how humanity has built and destroyed and built again across the millennia. For those who seek the real history, the history that includes all of humanity's achievements and not just those of one race or continent, the story of Aksum is essential. It challenges comfortable narratives. It forces recognition of uncomfortable truths. It demands that we acknowledge Africa's place in the ancient world, that we credit Africans with the civilizations they built, that we stop erasing or minimizing African achievements to preserve myths about European or Western superiority. This is not about replacing one biased history with another. It is about truth, about completeness, about ensuring that the full story of humanity includes all of humanity's peoples and places. The legacy of Aksum extends far beyond the physical monuments and the historical record. It lives in the pride of Ethiopians who know they are descended from one of the ancient world's great civilizations. It lives in the traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has preserved Aksumite Christianity through 15 centuries of isolation and challenge. It lives in the Ethiopian script and language, which maintain continuity with ancient ge'ez. It lives in the national identity of a people who were never successfully colonized, who maintained their independence through centuries when most of Africa fell under European domination, who can point to an unbroken tradition of statehood stretching back to antiquity. But the legacy of Aksum also belongs to the broader African world and to humanity as a whole. It belongs to anyone who has been told that Africa had no history, no civilization, no achievements worth remembering. It belongs to anyone who has internalized the racist narratives that portrayed black people as inferior and incapable. It belongs to anyone who wants to understand human history in all its complexity and diversity. The story of Aksum is proof that these narratives were lies, that African civilizations were as sophisticated and powerful as any, that the color of one's skin has nothing to do with one's capacity for achievement and greatness. As we move further into the 21st century, the work of reclaiming and celebrating African history becomes ever more important. The prejudices and biases that erased Aksum from popular consciousness have not disappeared. They persist in subtle and overt forms, shaping how history is taught, how contemporary Africa is perceived, how people of African descent are treated. Every time the story of Aksum is told, every time evidence of African achievement is presented and celebrated, it challenges these prejudices. It asserts that Africa has always been part of human civilization, that Africans have always been fully human, with all that implies, that the future of Africa and its peoples is not limited by the false histories that portrayed the continent as backward and its people as inferior. The stones of Aksum stand as monuments not just to the kingdom that erected them, but to a larger truth about humanity. We are capable of extraordinary things. We can build civilizations that span continents, that create beauty and wealth and knowledge. We can organize ourselves into complex societies that accomplish feats of engineering and art that astound later generations. We can reach across differences of language and culture to trade and communicate and learn from one another. And we can do all of this regardless of race or ethnicity, regardless of the color of our skin or the continent of our birth. The people who built Aksum were African, were black, and they achieved what any people can achieve, given opportunity, resources, and determination. But the stones also remind us of a darker truth, that all our achievements are fragile, that civilizations fall, that power is fleeting, and that even the greatest monuments crumble in time. Aksum, which once rivaled Rome, is now a collection of ruins in a provincial Ethiopian town. The kingdom's wealth has vanished, its power has evaporated, its name has been forgotten by most of the world. This is the fate of all civilizations, all empires, all human endeavors. We build for eternity, but nothing is eternal. We create monuments to outlast us, but the monuments themselves decay. We tell our stories and carve them in stone, but the stories are forgotten and the stones erode. Yet there is something defiant in the act of building anyway, of creating monuments and civilizations, knowing they will not last forever. The Aksumites knew that empires fall. They had seen the decline of Meroe, the transformation of Rome, the rise and fall of dynasties across the ancient world. But they built anyway, erected their massive stelae anyway, minted their coins and conducted their trade and waged their wars anyway. They lived their lives with full commitment to their present, even knowing it would become past, even knowing they would be forgotten. And in a sense, they have not been forgotten. We are remembering them now, telling their story again, bringing them back from the silence that engulfed them. This is the final lesson of Aksum, that forgetting is not inevitable, that silenced voices can speak again, that erased histories can be recovered. The work of historians and archaeologists, of communities maintaining oral traditions, of descendants preserving cultural practices, of scholars and educators challenging dominant narratives, all of this work can resurrect civilizations from obscurity, can give voice to the voiceless, can restore to humanity the full richness and complexity of its past. The story of Aksum was nearly lost, but it has been found again. The kingdom may have fallen, but its memory has been resurrected. The people may have been forgotten, but they are remembered now. The great stelae of Aksum still stand in the Ethiopian highlands, weathered monuments to a forgotten superpower. They challenge us to remember, to learn, to acknowledge, to celebrate. They demand that we see Africa's place in human history, that we credit Africans with their achievements, that we stop erasing or minimizing the contributions of an entire continent and its peoples. They are more than stone, they are testaments, witnesses, accusers. They ask us, what other stories have been forgotten? What other achievements have been erased? What other truths have been buried beneath centuries of prejudice and lies? And they challenge us to seek out these stories, to tell them, to ensure that the full story of humanity is finally told, complete, honest, inclusive of all peoples and all places. The stones have stood for 1,500 years. They will stand for centuries more, silent witnesses to both the glory and the tragedy of Aksum, reminders of what was achieved and what was lost, monuments to a superpower that the world forgot, but that refuses to remain forgotten.